Specifically with regard to economic labels, I think that's got to be a product of kind of our Western productivity-oriented culture, success-oriented culture. We're a very doing culture as opposed to thinking or contemplating. We're doers. We just don't know how not to quantify what we're doing and its success, or I should say effectiveness, by how much money that's earning us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Julie Richter, and I'm the lead pastor here to Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is our worship director, Eric Chkowski. Hey, Eric, how's it going?
Good to be with you as always.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, we just finished our third Sunday of our series called Labels, where we're taking a look at different ways that we stereotype people, that we put names and labels on people. And Julie preached specifically on economic labels, and I think this is such an important topic right now, because whether you're on a polar side of the conversation or you're sort of caught in the crossfires, there's a lot of back and forth around economics, around maybe even the term class warfare, around what the rich think about the poor and the poor think about the rich, and who's to blame for maybe the circumstances that people are in. Is it systematic? Is it pure dumb luck, choices that people make, or a combination of all of those things?
Well, and I think that word blame is something that's a really important thing for us to touch on, and we touched on Sunday as well, that we are constantly looking for answers to questions and struggles and problems. And so as a means to try and solve those problems, as a means to try to have answers to those questions, we tend to want to blame people and put people as issues rather than seeing them truly as people, not problems to be solved. And so in that process of blaming people, sometimes we end up villainizing people, or people end up getting victimized in the process. So I think that we've got a helpful conversation today about how we maybe can have better conversations around finances and faith.
And so with that, we're really excited to welcome Micah Peacock to the podcast today. Micah has sort of a unique intersection of careers, so we're really anxious to talk to him about money and economics and how we label people in those ways and how it ties to the church.
We've got a very special person on the podcast today. We are here with Micah Peacock. Micah is a friend of ours, but also a financial advisor and a worship leader. And so he is here to talk to us today about economic labels and maybe how we can talk about them a little bit differently in the church. So thanks for being here today, Micah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So tell us just a little bit first about what you do professionally and what got you to this point in your career.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, let's see, went to college in University of Houston, got a music and education degree. After college, I traveled for a little bit doing the starving artist, touring musician gig. Eventually got tired of eating Chinese takeout in the back of a van. And so decided to pursue a job as a worship leader. I started cutting my teeth at worship leading at a church in Manhattan, Kansas, of all places. Go Wildcats. And so I led there just north of K-State University for about 3 years, then got connected with Arthur Jones, who's another pastor here in the UMC, to do a launch of a new service at a Methodist church in West Plano, right down the road. And so did that for about 4 years. When I moved to Dallas in 2012, I got married to my wife, Lauren. And 2015, our first child came along. It was our son. And so when he was born, I don't know really how to describe it, but when he was born, I just decided, I wanted to have an opportunity to go to church as a family together and not be, my time not be completely spoken for every weekend, in and out. And so just wanted to make sure that I could have some experiences with him where he would be able to form some memories of us going to church together and me not always being busy. And so I started to just think about, what would be next. I always, said that I would do worship leading as long as I knew I was supposed to be doing worship leading, but I had this sense that just another chapter would be starting, didn't quite know what that was. So I took some time to explore that. My wife graciously supported us with her work when I did that. And then, eventually through a series of just mutual connections and conversations, got connected with an investment management firm here in DFW and became a part of a team of advisors that really a lot of whom came from ministry backgrounds. And so it made more and more sense about how this industry is really about irrigating wisdom into people's lives and having other people's best interests at heart. And that was very similar to my ministry background. So the more I explored it and the more I pursued it, the more it made sense for me just in terms of my gifting and my wiring. So that's what I've been doing for the last almost 2 years now. And I still get to lead worship every once in a while for another church in the area as well.
So one of the reasons we're so excited to talk to you about this is your ministry background, the fact that you, even in the financial world, work with a lot of people who have a similar ministry background to you. And so the intersection of those two things, I think, will be really interesting in this conversation. So we just finished the third Sunday in our series called Labels. So I wanted to ask you why, from an economic standpoint, why do we label people as poor or rich or as bums or entitled? What would you say?
Man, that's a good question. I think labels exist, period, not just in the economic space, but in life, is because we have this inherent need to understand and to quantify and to put reasons to things. And so I think that's one reason that labels exist in the first place, is just so we can make sense of what we don't understand or things that are not like us. But specifically with regard to economic labels, I think that's got to be a product of kind of our Western productivity-oriented culture, success-oriented culture. We're a very doing culture as opposed to thinking or contemplating. We're doers. And it's part of the fabric of our nation and the fabric of capitalism, which is a really good thing. But I think particularly in the West, in America, we're constantly looking for ways to measure our success. And the way that tends to happen is by how much money we earn. And so we have this inner critic that's kind of critiquing how much we're earning as compared to our peers or our previous generations of our family or whatever, and even, cross industry. So I think we do it, one, as a way to make sense of what we don't understand or people that don't seem to be like us, and two, we just don't know how not to quantify what we're doing and its success, or I should say effectiveness, by how much money that's earning us. I think the two are tethered together, for better and for worse.
So speaking of stigmas around money, can you talk to us just about what do you think some of the biggest stigmas around money are?
Well, I know that in Dallas-Fort Worth, there's kind of a culture of needing to be successful. And so I think one of the stigmas is probably, if you don't earn X, Y, or Z, or if your lifestyle doesn't look like this, that, or the other, you're going to be labeled as one thing. Whereas if it did, you'd be labeled as something else, possibly more favorable, So I think there's a lot that goes into that, but I think it's really just a product of a success and professional drive. A culture that's oriented that way is going to believe certain things about you based on what you earn.
Well, that reminded me of another label that we didn't mention earlier around money, but that would be trust fund baby, right? So those who even come into this world more financially set up than other people. And I think that that's sort of an interesting either stigma or label that is centered in Dallas. I mean, different areas of Dallas are incredibly low income. And then miles down the road, you have other incredibly affluent areas of Dallas where it's not just one person's wealth, but it's a generational wealth or a family wealth that sets a group of people up on a completely different path than others.
Yeah, especially in the South too, right?
Yeah.
You hear about old money, family money, things like that.
So we've thrown out some of these labels: poor, rich, entitled, trust fund baby. What do you see as some of the biggest misconceptions around these kinds of labels?
Well, I'm not sure about just misconceptions with regard to the labels, but I do know that the labels that we tend to apply thinking that they mean one thing often can mean another. For example, really to determine somebody's wealth, it's not necessarily a product of their income, because somebody can be earning a lot, but spending even more than they earn. And so from a net worth standpoint, they're in the red. And so that person wouldn't really be considered wealthy, but because they have income earning potential or the income earning ability, people think they are wealthy. And so they treat them as if they are wealthy, and they think of them and speak of them as if they are wealthy. So no matter what the label is, I think there could be a lot of wiggle room as to if that's actually true in their lives. Money is a very personal thing. People hold it close, and it should be. It's a very intimate part of life. But it's also one that's what you see isn't necessarily what you get by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, that's a really good reminder that the income potential or even the habits around money that we don't see, the optics around what people make, what people don't make, how hard they work, how hard they don't work, the optics sometimes are very different from the reality, and just so important for us to be willing to look into the reality, I think, rather
Absolutely.
than what the
It's
optic
why,
is.
Undercover Boss was a show. You know,
Yeah.
because you can easily mistake somebody based on their appearance or what they're doing in a given moment or where they're, physically located, and mistake the fact that they are something completely different.
Yeah. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about Jesus and the perspective of our finances around money. So how do you see Jesus talking about money, or to those either with money or to those that have a lack of money?
Yeah, so he talked about it a whole lot. So it was a very popular subject. And I think that's true because there's something in the human condition, at least, post-fall human condition, to struggle with it. So the primary message I hear from Jesus when he's talking about money is a correlation between your heart, your affections, and your devotions, and where your money is. So I think he understood that hardwired into our fabric, there's going to be a tension, a rub that says, if our money is somewhere, we're inevitably going to have a portion of our devotion and our attention and our affection materially attached to it. And so I think he was really shooting, an arrow into the heart of that conversation, saying, value something more than what money can buy, because he understood that the draw and the lure of it is so easy to attach to. So I think his message is constantly saying, where your heart is, there your treasure will be. And I think that's a two-sided thing, where if you put your value and you pursue things that are eternal in nature, that's going to have implications for your life, but also it's just stating the obvious. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So if you have put all of your time and energy and devotion into the pursuit of monetary earthly wealth, you will be consumed by it. So I think it's both a calling and a stating the fact of the way of life here. So those are the things that I really hear from him in what he speaks about money.
So do you have a story in mind of a time when you saw labels being put on someone and maybe how it affected that person or how it affected you?
Yeah, so I have a story of my own labels that I was putting on people, that those labels got torn down in a hurry. So I'll refer back to, this was 2014, and was part of the Methodist church here in Plano, and we wanted to record an album, through the church that we could eventually benefit a local nonprofit with. And it was going to cost a lot more money than I can afford, and so we needed to do the fundraising through the church so we could use it as a tax conduit and all that. So, we went fundraising. We took a lot of people out to breakfast and lunch and dinner and kind of cast the vision for the project in the hope that they would catch a glimpse of that and want to be a part of it and give to it. And so I knew that there were wealthy people in West Plano. I knew that there were wealthy people in the church. For some reason, I just assumed that people with that level of wealth would hold on to it with tight fists. And, they would need to be a benefactor of somebody or give to some other organization or give to some kind of special event or charity, but not to a project, as seemingly minuscule as this. I just had that impression that, this wasn't going to work because we were going to talk to people that just wanted to hold on to their money for this, that, or the other. But what I realized was quite the opposite. And we would cast the vision for the project, and then so many, person after person after person and couple after couple just said, tell us what you need. We understand. We want to be a part of it. How much do you need? And they would just essentially open up the wallet to us. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because they had an understanding of the value that it was going to provide. And when I say return on investment, not from dollars, but from a community outreach standpoint and from a ministry standpoint, they knew that it was going to be bigger than that. And so where I went into those conversations thinking, gosh, we're going to be lucky to get any kind of donation here, I was blown away by the generosity of those people. And that really changed how I looked at people, especially having first moved to Dallas-Fort Worth and knowing that kind of air, that air of wealth was a very palpable thing.
Yeah, so as we talk about the church, what are some things that you would hope that the church would speak about in terms of finances?
I wish, one, that they would speak a little bit more about the dangers of getting in debt without a plan. I think that's something that's really hindering the financial well-being and health of a lot of people. And in turn, I know that that can cause great stress in a family and a marriage. So I think it would be good for the church to speak more about the dangers of debt and then be willing to resource their congregants with relationships or other resources or classes or whatever that can help people get a plan in place for mitigating that debt. Generosity is a big one. I think if churches, there's kind of this, that's a stigma for you. There's kind of a stigma that when a new person comes to church for the first time and he happens to come in the series where they're talking about giving and generosity and stewardship, he thinks, oh, it's the pastor wanting money. Oh, it's the church wanting money. And I know that that's out there. But I also know that generosity is something that God wants for us, not from us. And so I think if the church was willing to boldly speak into that, we would see much better participation, honestly, because I think it's still true, and I don't really have statistics to back this up, but I would be willing to bet that it's true that most churches are supported by the select few that are committed to it. And so I think more than dollar amounts or giving records or certain levels of donation, I think it's developing a practice. Teach people in a very hands-on, tangible way how to develop a practice of giving, whether it's $1 or $100,000, get in the habit of learning to open up your fists a little bit. And I know that that's a value that the church talks a lot about, but I don't know if we've really done a great job of giving people tangible resources to tackle it.
I love the way you say that generosity is something that God wants for us, not from us. A few weeks ago, we had John Thornburg on, someone that I know you know well. And John told us a story about a time when he also was going to church members for capital campaign funding and had a congregation member who went back and wrote him a really sizable check and said, thank you for the opportunity to be generous. Thank you for opening that door for me and giving me that opportunity.
That's huge, yeah.
Yeah, we make a lot of assumptions by not asking people just to simply be generous. I think a lot of people are actually looking for that opportunity that we're maybe not giving them because of labels that we even put on people inside the church. So I think that's really helpful.
So we've talked a lot about generosity, but we also are very aware of the fact that all of our churches, this one included, have neighbors that are in need financially. So how as a church, how as Christians can we respond to our neighbors in need in a generous, loving, and open way?
Man, that's a big question. I would say, first of all, and certainly John Thornburg would speak to this as well, but I think it starts with identifying the need that you're well suited to meet. I think churches sometimes tackle issues that may be better met by another church in the area that's more suited to match it. So I think finding a level of congruency between a need that you feel called to meet and the need that you actually have resources to meet is a big deal. But I think really any need can be met, any kind of vision can be realized if people can have a genuine way to glom onto it, to grab hold of it. If they're given, this will look like this. This will produce change that looks like X, Y, and Z. And they can catch onto that wave and ride the wave into that vision themselves. They're going to want to be a part of it. So identifying the need and finding a congruency between what you feel called to and what you have resource for, and then really painting a vivid picture to show people what life could look like on the other side of that had they been a part of it.
Well, and how true is it that even in labels, that when we paint a vivid picture or tell a true story, the story is what moves us beyond the label. There's a difference between helping someone who is homeless or providing a meal for someone who is hungry versus saying this person is so-and-so who is this gender, this age, in this struggle, and this is how they got there. And I think that when we open ourselves more and listen to one another's stories beyond just the labels that are in front, we not only see people, but we see a need that we're more able to help provide assistance to.
Mm-hmm. So for someone individually who's struggling, what are some things that we as individuals can say or do that might be helpful in someone's life?
I would say, as is true with most things in life, darkness tends to run when light is shed on it, right? That's kind of a light and dark thing. So if there's areas of darkness or confusion or unhealthiness in a financial situation, shed light on it, right? Find a conversation with somebody that can speak truth and speak some wisdom and practicality into that situation. Because the more that you're going to keep it in secret and the more that you kind of tuck it away and, look, it's clearly easier to deal with it tomorrow, right? Sweep it under the rug, deal with it later. That's the easy decision. But the harder but better decision is to be vulnerable and to have a good conversation with somebody that can really speak some wisdom into the situation. So the first thing I'd say is open yourself up to a vulnerable conversation. Even though it may not feel good, it's going to be the quickest way to get healthy.
That's great. So, Micah, we've got one last question that we ask everyone who comes on the podcast. So at this point in your life, what is one thing that you wish someone would have told you?
Oh, gosh. Okay, so first, from a financial standpoint, save early, right? The time value of money, the math, it's just there. So save as early as you can, what you can as early as you can. In my 20s, I was busy spending money on things that made me happy or that I wanted or that I thought I wanted at the time or whatever. And now that I'm in my 30s and married and have kids and a house and all that, you quickly go from, okay, I used to spend money on things I wanted. Now I'm just spending money on things that reduce my stress level. And so, which is a pivot that inevitably happens. But yeah, save early, save what you can and save early. You know, from a cultural standpoint, so I started college in 2004, and that's about the time Facebook came out. And to use Facebook, you had to have a college registered email address, and there's this little thing down the left-hand side. You could click on the name of the school and find your friends, and it was a great way to just keep in touch with people you just graduated with, but you knew you weren't going to see as much. You know, if I could go back in time, I would have whispered in my own ear, don't bother, because it's going to become something so huge and so just out of control, all-encompassing. And there's a lot of good that can come from something that allows you to connect with other people, right? But I think I would have gone back to my 20 or 18-year-old self at the time, rather, and said, you know what? Don't worry about it. It's going to blow up and become something out of control. So use time elsewhere, you know?
Wow, that's great. Well, and it will create a facade of community that is not actual community.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, Micah, we appreciate you taking the time today. We love to hear about your experience in the intersection between finance and ministry, and just really appreciate your wisdom and taking the time to speak with us today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's an honor, guys. Thanks for having me.
So Micah reminded us today of two things that I think are so important that I want to highlight. One is around generosity, that God calls us to generosity not because God needs something from us, but God wants something for us. And I think that that is so helpful in the way in which we understand giving and understand giving with open hands and seeing it as an opportunity to have a life that is not always about self-preservation, but rather giving of ourselves, both our time and our resources. The second thing has to do with that word labels and the labels that we put on each other. And what Micah reminded us of is that sometimes those labels are more perceived rather than accurate, meaning that a person can be considered wealthy but living way beyond their means, and a person can be considered poor but maybe living well below their means. And so as we think about the economic labels that we put on each other and the way in which we see each other through our earning potential, I think that God still calls us to abundance, that it's not really about the bottom line, about what we are giving in terms of a dollar amount, but the fact that we are called to give all of ourselves, regardless of what that number is.
And so one of the most beautiful images from Scripture about giving all of ourselves is found in Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Hear these words. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
Thank you so much for tuning in to More Than Sunday. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or YouTube to not miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church, Richardson, you can find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Micah Peacock for joining us this week. And be sure and tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Kim Myers about physical labels that we put on one another. Have a great week.